I finally left Chicago when I was 18, I think it was, because of a bad attack of asthma, which might have been brought on because I wanted to leave. So can you go home again? It's a little like reaching a measuring stick back into the past in a way that helps you to measure change and progress. You learn more about yourself today from what you were yesterday. It started to rain. Not for the first time here in Chicago, not for the last time, sure. It started to rain just a few minutes ago. But it's a familiar sound. I'm home again. Now, we all know what the word again means, but the word home is harder to define. In my case, it doesn't mean a particular building. I lived in a dozen in this city, I guess. Some of them are torn down now, and the rest should be. And it doesn't mean, in my case, where Mother and Father lived. My father died when I was about a year and a half old. My mother lives in California now. Although I was born in New York, Chicago is still home to me. I was raised here, not for any other reason than that my mother's family was a Chicago family. The Donahues. I guess they were from Bridgeport and back of the yards originally. Studs Lonigan country. Grandfather came from Ireland, settled in the back of the yard section back before the turn of the century. My mother, at the age of about 9, left town, traveled on the road with a group of circus aerialists, and became herself an aerial acrobat at a very early age with Barnum and Bailey. Then not long thereafter, she worked in vaudeville as a chorus girl, eventually as a comedian, and she still is what Milton Berle says, the funniest woman in show business. But she worked over the years with a succession of acts and partners, and one of them, a fellow named Billy Allen, married her and fathered me. I have no recollection of him, naturally. But I do remember things from the early years, theaters, big dark theaters, vaudeville bills. I remember doing a lot of waiting in strange hotels for my mother to come back to the theater, strange hotels and rooming houses. My mother had to work, you see, to keep all of us eating, and that meant she had to travel on the road. Vaudeville was her way of supporting us. So I was usually left at home with various relatives or at various boarding schools. Then when I did travel with Mother, things weren't much better. So mainly I gypsied it up. I'm not complaining now. Things have turned out fine, but just giving you a little of the background. There were 3 years that I remember very clearly. 3 years at St. Joseph's Academy in LaGrange. That would be in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. Most of the kids there were from broken homes. I realize that now, looking back. Otherwise, they would have been in their own homes going to the neighborhood schools. So there were some grim times then, some lonely times. I learned then about the cruelty that can be found in the very young. There's a jungle down close to the ground that parents and teachers rarely peer into. I try to make it my business now to peer into that jungle where my own children live, but in those days I seem to remember having to fend for myself most of the time. And after you got knocked around often enough, you became permanently wary. But children find something to laugh about in almost any circumstance. The nights, though, at St. Joseph's and other boarding schools were, without exception, very lonely. There was a pattern. The new children would always cry themselves to sleep for the first week or two. And then there were some days of no laughs on Sundays. That was visiting day, but not for everybody. Some of the kids didn't have parents, so parents didn't come to visit them. I remember writing some verse a few years back, a poem that referred back to that time. A few lines from it occur to me now. Save the teeth that fall out. Save bottle caps. Save something. Baseball cards or marbles. Crown jewels were never half so precious. Star-flecked Aggies rolled in sweaty palms, rolled in linted pockets, are something to hang on to. Ownership, havesmanship, look-you-guysmanship. Grasshoppers spit tobacco juice. Hold one on your open hand and feel your stomach crawl. Sunday. Sunday. Oh, please come and hug me Sunday. On this rainy day in Chicago, you can hear the rain, by the way, hitting on the roof of the Edgewater Beach Theater tent here. I recall that Thomas Wolfe tried to go home, found he could not. Others have tried, millions of people have tried, and found for the most part that you really can't go home again. Time just doesn't go backwards or even stand still for you. The past is a will-o'-the-wisp that cannot be reclaimed. But still, there's a compulsion at some time of your life, no matter who you are, a yearning to go back anyway. Just to look, just to make the effort. You may come back for brief visits, for speech-making or business stopovers or publicity, junkets, things of that sort. But eventually there comes a time when you come back to really look at the past, to do a little soul-searching, perhaps, about what you were then and what you are now, and to try to see what the difference between the two indicates. In my case, it took about, 7 or 8 times of returning to Chicago before a certain vague feeling of depression about the city was gone. When I first came back, it was a depressing experience, and each time it became a little less depressing. Well, this time I'm in Chicago for a play. I've been working here for the last couple of weeks in this tent. And now I hear people say, "Hey, you've come home." You hear them say that, and you realize not only that you can go look at the past, but that you want to. And you think, yes, this is home, Chicago. At least a special part of it is home. The old neighborhood. Everybody has his old neighborhood where the old gang hung around. And why do you call it home when you actually moved around so much? Well, I guess because it's where you grew from being a child to being, well, not a child, an almost adult. Something with a child's head stuck on top of an adult's body. It's where the tender and impressionable and aching years were spent. Where you came awake to the world around you, with its smells, its blur of movement, the feel of its streets, its sidewalks, its parks, its waterways, the river, the lake, its stone and brick and wood. And so I rented a car and drove down to the south side, out around the Hyde Park district, 55th Street, in the old neighborhood. It was all changed. For a moment, I thought I was on the wrong street. There were new high-rise apartment buildings, and the street went around them. None of it looked familiar at all. The buildings vaguely reminded me of the buildings I'd seen in Rome. Very new, but somehow European. Something had been leveled and erased in the whole block. I couldn't remember exactly what had been there before. But this was 55th Street, and somewhere ahead was Woodlawn Avenue. Woodlawn between 55th and 53rd. The 2 blocks around that area was where I wanted to go. Woodlawn and Kimbark and... and then it began to look very familiar. Although part of it was missing. Just ahead there at the corner. That's Kimbark and 55th. And my old school just on the right, St. Thomas. It's funny what a kick you got out of just seeing a building. It looked exactly the same. Oops, and then suddenly I realized I was driving the wrong way. They'd changed it to a one-way street. I managed to swing into an alley and turn around. I'm pretty sure nobody saw me. I knew that Woodlawn would be the next street over, and that was really where I wanted to go. Things were a little more familiar then. Something here, something there that catches your eye and says, this is the place, the old neighborhood, home. Yeah, this was the place, but I couldn't remember exactly what had been on the corner. A jewelry store, I think. It was gone, too. I pulled up by St. Thomas's, started to get my bearings a little better then. Yeah, it was the old neighborhood, all right. Row on row of three-story brick or stone buildings, 3 flats on each side. I had lived in a number of them. And St. Thomas's, school, church. It was one of the pleasanter things to remember, along with Sister Seraphia. She'd been my 7th and 8th grade teacher.
As a boy, as an 8th grade boy, Steve was tall and slender, had great poise, and even his actions showed his intellectual ability. And he was never at a loss for a word to contribute to the vocabulary in any situation.
My mind went back to a very cold day in, I think it was 1936. Somebody said, look, if you stick your tongue on the iron fence, your tongue will stick to it. So I stuck my tongue on it. Somebody was right. It got stuck.
He never liked to do his homework. It wasn't creative, see? And he had the creative ability to do his own type of work. Steve took it as an obligation, and boy-like would prefer to be writing poems.
Seems as if the cap was always unscrewed on the old fire plug. I guess kids never change. I don't know why I wanted to take a drink out of that fire plug, but I did.
When Steve was ill, I suppose the flu was a common term those days, too. Sister Agnesita and I went to see him, and they were both, he and his mother were very, very sociable. He recovered. I was glad to have him back into school because he was missed by everyone, particularly me.
The buildings in the neighborhood had pretty much the same look. There were 3 flat brick apartment buildings, had ledges and indentations in the brick walls. I remembered you could walk along a building by hanging on to the bricks and standing on the lower ledge and never have to touch the sidewalk or the grass. Once I traveled past 3 or 4 buildings that way. Sometimes it doesn't take very much to amuse a kid. There was a gang of us in the neighborhood, a bunch of fellows who hung around together. You know, it's a funny thing, I can still remember all their names. Sometimes I don't now remember names of people I met yesterday, but I remember the names of the old gang. In fact, I can even say a lot of them backwards. Najik Ruoro, that was John O'Rourke. Cadge Regals, that was Jack St. Ledger. Trevor Illertep, that was Bob Petroli. Eni Leh, that was Elaine Hill, a girl I used to go with. And Drucker Yellick, that's Dick Kiley backwards. Richard Kiley is now the well-known Broadway actor. He lived on the 3rd floor, one of these buildings right here. We used to sit on the balcony a lot, sit on the front steps, talk about things we were going to do, where we were going to go, what we wanted from life. For some reason, I can remember a lot of addresses in the neighborhood, too. I don't know why. Sometimes it's hard to forget unpleasantness, perhaps. Well, I wanted to keep moving and looking. When you're a kid, they don't have playgrounds around the neighborhood. You play a game called pinner or sidewalk baseball, or whatever it's called. You get a ball, bounce it up against the step somewhere, and somebody catches it. If they catch it on the fly, it's an out. If they catch it on the bounce, that's a hit. Over the head is a home run. I remember I was very serious about wanting to be a pitcher when I was a kid. I practiced a lot, had a pretty good arm. I still pitch a little. I don't really pay much attention to baseball now, but when I was a kid, I knew the names of all the White Sox and Cubs players around 1936, 37, 38. I can still remember them better than I know the names of some of today's players. The names had a certain glamour. Names like Zeke Bonora, Chuck Klein, Lon Warnicki, Charlie Root. When you're one of the neighborhood kids that lives in one of these 3 flat buildings, you have a lot of time to kill. If you got a ball, you play this game, pinner. It's a lot of fun. You don't think about a lot of things directly when you're a boy. You don't realize that a memory is a memory when the thing first occurs to you. You feel it first, and then you think things through later. I passed an alley. There was something familiar about it. I didn't remember what. Something interesting had happened in that alley to me one time, but couldn't quite recall. And then there was the corner up ahead, the corner of Woodlawn and 54th. The center of the neighborhood, as far as I was concerned. When I saw that corner, I really started to move ahead. That was it. That was my corner. I think I must have spent at least a good 5 years of my life right there. 5 years of my life just hanging around. Sitting on a green pipe fence. That's what we did. After school, we'd come around, or at night after dinner, we'd come around. All the gang would just sit there and talk, make jokes, watch the cars go by with a little envy in our hearts because we didn't have them. So you get a little older, you stop playing the ball game on the steps, you spend more time sitting around the corner. Yeah, this was the place. This was the center of it. All around. I remember there was a fellow who lived right up the street here. He was older than the rest of us. I think he was about 19 or so. Very good-looking fellow. Muscles, very well built. If anybody had said, look, you kids, you can be him when you get older. Just sign here on the dotted line, and you can be just like this man. I think we all would have signed right there. The more I looked around, the more it began to sink in, the feel of the place. I ran away from home a number of times as a kid, wherever home was. Originally, when I was very small, I guess I just wanted to run away to find my mother, and then later I simply wanted to get away, to get out of the neighborhood, take to the hills, to be on the lookout for something. For what, I don't know, just something that always seemed beyond my reach. We didn't spend all our time on the fence. We sat on the mailbox, too. I knew it was the same mailbox. Had a million layers of green paint on it. Then I wanted to move on, see the rest of it. There was an areaway just down from the corner building. I remember one night when I was about 15 or 16, I put on an old Navy cape that my mother had picked up somewhere and a black fedora hat, and I stood in between the two buildings here and pretended that I was Lamont Cranston, the Shadow. Remember him? As people went by, I'd stand there in the darkness and go, the Shadow knows, things of that sort. And pretty soon I had a group of about 30 or 40 people that I'd scared to death, and then suddenly an off-duty policeman and his girlfriend came by. This guy jumped in at me, actually stuck a pistol right in my gut, and pulled so hard on the cape that the snaps came plinking off. That was my last performance as the Shadow. We used areaways like this for one other thing, and a stupid, frightening thing it is now as I look back at it. Occasionally we would jump from one roof to the other, across this sort of a space. I hope there are no young people doing that today. I think maybe they have a little better sense today, a lot of them. And just next to the building was the empty lot where we played baseball. It was at a lower level than the sidewalk then. It was down in a depression. Now they'd filled it in and fenced it up. Thinking way back, I remember the first day I came to the lot, a bunch of guys were playing baseball. I was the new kid in the neighborhood. And somebody saw me standing on the sidewalk there, and they said, "Hey, kid, you want to play?" They needed another man, I guess, to fill in the outfield. And I remember now, with great shame, one of the boys was what I now understand is a cerebral palsy victim. But I didn't know that at the time. I remember his head kind of hung over to one side and his arms dangled in a funny way. I didn't know he was a CP, and I went down into the lot doing some kind of a stupid imitation of him. I remember suddenly that I realized he was crippled, and I stopped at once. I think I learned something important about comedy right then, something I've never forgotten. Another thing I don't look back upon with any pride at all is that I was, to a certain extent, anti-Semitic and anti-Negro when I was a kid. That's just the way it was in our neighborhood. We didn't think it out, we didn't plan it, we weren't really taught it. It just was absorbed from the atmosphere. And the real horror of it is that it never occurred to us to feel guilty about it. No. It's also strange that not once do I remember hearing a word of warning about the danger, the sinfulness of such prejudice. I was fixing a bicycle in a garage along one of these alleys one time with another fellow, Bob Petroli. We were only about 14 at the time. Suddenly we looked up and there were a couple of Negro boys standing by the door watching us. Bob said something like, "Go on, you guys, get out of here," something like that. And the two kids yelled something pretty earthy back at us and started to run. I remember I got angry at what they'd said and I felt I should do something to them. There was an empty half-pint can of white paint on the floor. Bob's father had been using it for something. I remember I picked it up. I had a pretty good arm, being a pitcher. I jumped out in the alley and threw it at the kids as they ran away. I remember it hit this one boy in the back of the neck. I can still see the white paint suddenly splattering down the back of his head and the back of his clothes. Wish I knew who he was. I'd like to shake his hand and apologize now. Funny how clear that picture prints in my mind. I can still see the image of the one boy with the white paint running down the back of his head. It's a picture you don't erase easily. corner of 53rd Street, right near the empty lot, was the old drugstore. Every young kid has a drugstore that he hangs around, doesn't he? Only I discovered it's not a drugstore anymore. I think it used to be called Sam's. The building was still there, but drugstore was gone. Remember, a lot of us used to hang out there, too, and get soft drinks. Remember, there was a drink called Green River. They used to have it in a lot of the Chicago drugstores in those days. You'd see a bottle or a jar on the fountain that had a picture on it, a moon shining down a sort of a mysterious-looking green river. It's interesting, too, when you try to remember what was at a place where buildings have been torn down. You're never exactly sure what was there before. It's a little like somebody you know who has had an operation on their nose. About a week after you see the new nose, you can't remember what the old one looked like. When we weren't sitting back at the other corner, we were always hanging around the drugstore. Kids will always find a place like that. And then across the street, I saw the old dime store, the old 5 and 10 cent store. Remember, if we had any extra cash to blow, that's sometimes where we would go to spend it. Birthdays, Christmas, even when we didn't have money, we'd go look in the window once in a while or just walk through the store, just dream shopping. They were out of business. All gone. And then down the corner a ways was the entrance to the alley that we'd always cut through to get from 53rd to 54th. More or less out of habit, I swung into it. It's a typical Chicago alley, cleaner than some, dirtier than some others. I guess it's very much like any alley in any big city. It's the unglamorous side of a city, the kind you never see in the postcards or the newsreels. All kinds of gates, fences, running into it, walling their way right up to the edge. I guess I must have walked down this alley 1,000 times or more as a kid. Didn't really look any different. But somehow it didn't look the same either. I remember this one fence painted green. I think I recall it because I remember I could never see over it in the old days. I always wondered what was behind it. Nothing special, just the back of a house. But still, I used to be curious. And then coming around again to where the empty lot had been in the old days, now they had this very fine basketball court connected with the playground. I wish we'd had something like that when we were in the neighborhood. Hey, kids, let's see the ball. Well, I wanted to move on alone, so I moved out. When people see you unexpectedly, there's sometimes a delayed reaction. They're not sure it's really you. Sometimes you can move on before they know it. That down here near the end of the alley was where the Mahoneys lived. It was a tall building for a home. It was a big, well-built brick house. The Mahoneys were one of the leading families in the neighborhood, possibly the only family in the neighborhood with money. There was Margaret Mahoney, Tommy, about my age, his older brother John. We went to school with Margaret and Tom. The Mahoneys had a basement room fixed up with a ping-pong table and a piano, playroom. When we weren't at the drugstore or down in the corner, we'd be there. In fact, I first learned to play the piano by ear at the Mahoneys. Most of us kids lived in apartments or two-room flats, and we didn't have a nice place to have the other kids come in, but we were always welcome at the Mahoneys. They liked to have young people around. I went there a lot. I like to get at the piano. I kept going toward the end of the alley. I wanted to see the Mahoney's house again. I'd used their piano to learn to play. Wrote some of my first songs on it, as a matter of fact. I suppose I wondered if there was an answer there to what leads me now to write so much music. Somehow I didn't remember that the bushes were quite as grown over on the sidewalk as they now seem to be, but then I realized 20 years had gone by. I wondered if the Mahonies themselves were still there. A lot of the places in the neighborhood were empty now or changed or were made into apartments. I wanted to take a look. It was just all one home in the old days. I couldn't see now if there were extra mailboxes inside or apartments. I thought of the basement room where the piano and the ping pong table had been. I could hear the echo of old laughter. I couldn't see in there at all. And then, by golly, Mr. Mahoney himself came to the door. He'd seen somebody out front. They'd been away, he told me, and had just come home. Just reopened the house. Mrs. Mahoney came to the door, too. Of course, Mr. Mahoney said, "Come on in." The piano's still there in the recreation room.
He was along with a tall young man. Well, it looked like a beanpole. He was so thin. I don't know that he had more than enough to eat in the old days, but he always seemed to get by and was always cheerful.
Yeah. The place hadn't changed much. Same old lamp was there. The piano looked exactly the same.
He seemed to be quite bashful, too, as a young fellow. You know, now he can get up and make a talk and without any qualms or not being the least bit perturbed about it, but you'd never dream that he'd do that when he was a boy growing up. Never dream it.
I remember Blue Moon was one of the popular songs about that time. I was going to Hyde Park High School. Going to Hyde Park was one of my first escapes, in a sense, from the old neighborhood and the old gang. I'm sorry to admit now I wasn't too attentive to my work in school until Marguerite Byrne, a kindly teacher, took me under her wing, helped to straighten me out.
He was recommended to me by another English teacher in whose class he was doing nothing. She said, "I think he has a great deal to offer, but I can't get it from him." I had a class in creative writing. We published a magazine every semester. Steve came down and offered his services. He has left since then. He said, I said I could write everything, short stories, poetry, essays, detective stories, and whatnot. And it was true, he could. Even at 17, he was really proficient in all of them. I think Steve was sensitive about being poor. Poor to him meant, I suppose, defeat. Where you just couldn't make good on your own or something like that. It was, poverty to him just wasn't comfortable. And although he shouldn't have felt any different, every youngster in the school at that time was just as poor as could be. In my own little group, that creative writing class, I think they were all very unusual in what they could do. Steve was head and shoulders over all of them, and they all knew it. There was no jealousy. Steve was just something they couldn't approach.
There's a park, beautiful park across the street from the school. And sometimes when I got off the streetcar at 62nd, Stony Island Avenue in the morning, I'd just turn left into the park instead of right to the school. I'd just walk into the park and keep right on going.
He was often over in the park writing poetry or making up a song when he was supposed to be in a science class or language class or math class. The urge would probably well up in him, so it just had to find expression. When he was brought back to school, there was never an alibi. He had nothing to say for himself. In class, he was never mischievous. Anytime he didn't want a class, he just stayed out. He never disturbed it.
I have a picture taken of me sitting in front of an old girlfriend's house. Jean Fisher was her name. And I knew she didn't live there anymore, but thought it might be interesting to look at the old building. Much to my surprise, another girl from school did live there now. Ruth was her name. I'd forgotten her last name, but she's now Mrs. Jack Adams.
Well, I had never been in any of his classes, but I do remember him as being a very quiet, serious boy in school. And he played piano beautifully. Very often after classes, he did play piano. And a great many of us used to sit in back of Loomis Hall, which was the assembly hall, and listen to him. Music was lovely.
She'd heard I was in the neighborhood, so we looked at the old high school annual together. Sometimes you don't know how much you've changed until you see the people you used to know. Wow. That was quite a picture. I look like I just got arrested for holding up a delicatessen. Wonder if I've changed as much on the inside. I used to take off into the park instead of going to school as I should have. Sometimes I'd spend the whole day walking along the windy lakefront or wandering through the enormous halls of the Museum of Science and Industry. It was a wonderful place. Still is, I'm sure. I remember that at one time they had a truant officer stationed at the door of the museum, but I never ran into him.
I suppose that he was taller and maybe more mature, maybe more purposeful. It was evident that he didn't come into this institution to waste his time. It was evident that he actually came here to learn something.
This time I met Dan McMaster, the head of the museum. And the museum was better than ever.
It was a real surprise to me that Steve Allen was so familiar with this institution, and particularly in view of the fact that he hadn't been here for 20 years. He could recall in great detail the individual exhibits that were housed here at that time, mentioning practically every one in the building. But in addition, he knew what the exhibits were for. He knew the technical details that they told. He knew the scientific facts that they presented. I was frankly surprised that anyone could remember that long. He obviously has a most retentive memory. It's interesting to us who are engaged here at the museum that a youngster, a teenager, can avoid going to school and still pick up so much information by visiting a place like this. It's really a revelation to us that he was so familiar with what was here.
I loved the park. Often I would just sit in the park near the museum, on the grass, under the sun, write poetry, short stories, suicide notes, anything. It was a lovely place to be when you didn't want to be with anybody else, or when there was nobody else around to be with. It was peaceful, fresh. It was away from things, made you forget problems. I used to sit there and dream about being a writer or an actor or something. I really didn't care what, as long as it turned out to be something. Seeing it all again brought back a mysterious sense of creating things, sitting alone in the park, wandering alone by the lagoon. It meant a great deal to me in the old days. It was probably my only chance, I now realize, to commune with nature, the great outdoors, as anybody should, any young fellow should. Better here, anyway, than in an alley or an areaway between two dingy buildings. I remember in the old days there were rowboats in the lagoons in the park. You could rent them by the hour. Sometimes I'd get into one and row out from the shore and just keep rowing. Just sit out there in the water and think. When you know you're not exactly a child anymore, you have a lot of things to figure out. And when you know you're not quite an adult as yet, sometimes it gets worse. I ran away from home when I was about 16. The last time, ran all the way to California. Way back before that, when I was about 5, my mother had boarded me out there with one of her sisters that lived in Los Angeles. And I guess I somehow remembered it as a great, free, beautiful green park. Not like the old neighborhood at all. It was a paradise with pink stucco bungalows, big Spanish mansions, tall, graceful pepper trees, a million flowers. When I was about 14 or 15, I used to run away from home, but at home they never knew it. They just knew I was gone all day. Sometimes I'd run away downtown to the Loop, just because it was exciting. I think I thought I was going to be a great newspaper man there someday. Or perhaps somebody in the theater. Of course, I always went home at night. I can remember as a boy coming out of theaters, leaving the glamorous world of movie make-believe and seeing suddenly with an aching despair the dirty sidewalks and the ordinary people, the glaring daylight of reality. You can feel pretty glum at the age of 14 looking at yourself in the store window and wishing that you were William Powell. There's one place down around this part of town I wanted to find. I knew it was on Michigan Avenue somewhere. It was a courtyard. When I was about 15 or 16, I'd been there once on a beautiful winter's night. There was a restaurant in the courtyard now. Back in that long-gone winter, it was empty. I had just wandered in through the gates, and it was snowing, I remember. It was like finding a little piece of Europe, sort of an enchanted fairyland. Beautiful. There's still an old-world atmosphere about the place. People were sitting in the sun, having lunch, removed from the world outside by the walls of the courtyard. To a teenager with a pretty wild imagination and the need of some romance in his soul, it was a beautiful place to find a lonely, snowy winter's night. During the Depression years that I grew up in the south side of Chicago. And for maybe 2 of those years, we lived here on Kimbark in the old neighborhood. I remember it as one of the dreariest times of my life. Lived in one room in this building. I hated the place. No matter where I went or how often I ran away, I always came back to the same place, same neighborhood. My roots were here with friends, family. Also, just somehow sunk down into the ground itself. Every place else I lived in the city was like it. They all looked alike, felt alike, smelled alike. But this was the original, the one and only, the old neighborhood. As I turned out of Kimbark and back onto 55th Street, I realized there'd been a house there in which I'd lived, off Kenwood, I think it was, and now it was gone, too. Down at the next block were the new townhouses where I had lived there, but the house was gone. rebuilding, slum clearance, or whatever you want to call it, was moving west, closer and closer, inexorably perhaps, hopefully so, into the old neighborhood. Driving out was not like driving in, but there was still something of a surprise about it. Suddenly you were moving away. Suddenly it all looked clean and fresh. And within a few minutes you were back in the regular, present-day world. Well, sir, I finally left Chicago when I was 18, I think it was, because of a bad attack of asthma, which might have been brought on because I wanted to leave. The method of leaving was pretty typical of our family. I just got on a train with my mother and went to Phoenix, Arizona. No advance reservations, no plans. Just got off the train there, walked around town, got located and began to live. That was the last of Chicago for a long, long time. Then life centered around Arizona, then Drake University in Iowa, back to Arizona again, and finally California, Hollywood, radio, TV, and all that you know about. I came through Chicago a number of times in the years since. Once, about 3 years ago, came back for the funeral of my Uncle Steve, about whom I had quite a bit to say in an autobiography I did a year or so ago. And for some reason, on those earlier trips, I was easily depressed by the city, as I think I mentioned a little while back. And even this time, the stirring up of so many old memories left me with certain moments that gripped me, but it was all a little different this time. So can you go home again? Well, in a way, yes, and in a way, no. You can physically make the trip. You can find some of your home ground still standing. Part of it's there unchanged, and part of it's gone. You can visit, but you can't stay. But just the fact of making the trip brings you something. It's an odyssey not without compensation. Because with the realization that you can't go home again, you mature a bit. You look at yourself then, and if you take an honest look, you can make some judgments about yourself now. It's a little like reaching a measuring stick back into the past in a way that helps you to measure change and progress. You learn more about yourself today from what you were yesterday. Now, what have I learned? How do I feel about Chicago? Well, we really don't have time in any one program to go into all of that, but I'll tell you one thing. I've made the discovery that there is such a thing as a Chicago voice, Chicago accent. I heard it for the first time, really, on this trip. In the old days, I would have denied it. When I lived here, I would have said, there's no such thing as a Chicago accent. This is the way people are supposed to speak English. Everyone else has an accent. People in Brooklyn and Boston, they have accents, but not we Chicagoans. Well, I heard this accent, this dialect, this voice, first in California. There were two fellows in a bar that I was in just a few months ago, and I finally said, hey, you guys from Chicago? And they said, yeah. And I had just assumed it from the sound of the voice. It's a particular tone, a quality of voice. It's not so much a matter of pronunciation. And then this trip, once here in Chicago, I could hear it more clearly all around me. As I say, it's not a matter of changing words the way they do in, say, Brooklyn or Texas or Kentucky. It's a matter of a tone. I think you hear it more in the men than in the women. It's the type of a voice you associate with a nice, friendly detective in a murder mystery movie. You hear it more, too, I think, in the middle classes. It's kind of a middle-class voice. You hear it in firemen and mailmen. It has a certain touch of shyness, covered over by a little outgoing joviality. And the personality comes through in a particular masculine way. If you can't hear it yourself here, however, all these words will be meaningless. And lastly, I'd say that it's an unneurotic voice. Now, does this characterization of a Chicago voice indicate an attitude that I've come to develop about the city? I suspect it does. It may indicate a settling within me, a coming to terms with the city of Chicago. I'll tell you one thing, the audiences here have been so warm and friendly, and the smile, as you see on the people in the streets, the smiles have been so open that this trip, it's been good being home.